Hey gang, welcome to another episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Thanks for the submissions on this one. They are all listeners who shared their crazy and creepy tales from their times working in fast food and in restaurants. I hope everybody else digs it. I worked at a pizza shop and a Burger King when I was a kid, so I can identify with some of these, but I have to say the craziest thing I ever saw in that time was a guy who kicked a glass door in. Yeah, I know. Terribly terrifying. Anywho, enjoy. Sit back, relax, let's begin. Birger Hell, submitted by Tennessee Ernie Fjord. Okay, I started working at a famous burger place when I was 17 and worked there into my sophomore year of college. I actually was allowed to work at one in my hometown during the summer and the one in my college town while I was at school. Totally dishonorable, but I would make a shit ton of food towards the end of my shift and sneak it into my bag before I left. My housemates would throw me beer money for it, and it was cool. I know, it's stealing, but we all did it, and I don't think my managers really cared. Some of them were just a couple years older than me and did it because it wasn't a bad paying job, just a lot of hours in dealing with the younger employees who were a handful not showing up or always showing up late. In school, we had our share of the drunk students and townies, but it wasn't that bad. But the one at home, that was another story. There was this regular who would come in named Tony and order the same thing almost every night. I knew this because my friends who worked on nights would tell me about him. He was in his 30s, always looked unwashed, and was quiet but kind of creepy. He would just get his food, go to the same booth, eat, smoke a few cigarettes, and then leave. I remember one day he came in and blew a gasket when he found out we changed our behind-the-counter pour station to a self-service pour station. He yelled that he paid us to serve him or something like that, and my manager Sue had to calm him down and give him some gift certificates or free food. Then shit started to get weirder. One night my friend Tina was working the drive-thru, and we heard a voice screaming over the intercom that he was ready to place his order. Tina hadn't heard the sensor go off and had no idea anyone was out there, but the guy was totally going crazy, screaming that he wanted his food. It was Tony. He had walked up to the drive-thru, placed his order, and then walked to the window. Tina got his stuff and told him that he really couldn't do that again, and shouldn't because he might get hurt if a car or truck didn't see him. He took his bag of food, whipped money at her, and screamed that he wasn't coming inside and pouring his own drink if he was paying us bitches to do it. Tina slammed the window shut and told our manager, who then ran outside to tell the guy he couldn't come back for a week, and when he did, he had to apologize to Tina. He left, and we didn't see him for a week. Then, he comes in one night with an old lady, and we found out later was his mother. He orders his food and makes her get his drink from the soda fountain, and then sits in his usual spot. She seemed haggard and run down, and my manager went out to ask if she would like something. Tony yelled out, "She doesn't need anything!" And the woman quietly said she would like a coffee. My manager got a coffee, and Tony just sat there staring at the cup as the old lady drank it and had a cigarette. Tony then ripped the cup from her hand, threw it on the floor, and screamed, "This is why you can't come here!" He grabbed her arm and dragged her out the door. My manager called the police, and they came out looking for him, but he was gone. He tried to come back a few times, but all the managers were aware of him and told him to leave every time, said he was no longer welcome at our place. One of my last days, I had gotten a better job by this time and had put in my notice. I was working on the morning shift and had to take the grease from the fryers and dump it into this 50-gallon drum next to our dumpster. I guess some company came out a couple of times a week and took it away. The drum and dumpster were enclosed in this wooden structure that had swinging double doors. I take the stinking shit out there and set the container down and open the doors, and standing inside the enclosure is Tony. I'll never forget it. His face looked like a mask. Deep, dark circles around his eyes, and this vacant stare coming out of his eyes. I looked down, and his hands were covered with blood, and there was a large chef knife in his hand. "I want my fucking food!" he screamed. I slammed the doors shut and slipped the iron thing that went into the parking lot and kept it closed, and I backed away from the enclosure. Suddenly, I heard Tony banging on the door and yelling to let him out. Yeah, fuck that. I ran back to the store and jumped into the office. There were never managers on this early in the morning, so I just called the police and told them what was happening. They said not to let anyone in the restaurant, to just shut things down. We didn't really open our doors for another hour. We just did drive-through service this early, so it wasn't a problem. I told my 2 other co-workers what was going on and not to go outside, and Katie ran to make sure the doors were locked. They were, and then we heard the cop car sirens coming. Suddenly, there's a banging on the drive-through window, and it's Tony, now covered in blood and smearing it on the glass with his hands. "Let me in! Let me in!" he's screaming. Katie screamed and backed away, and we heard voices saying, "Get on the ground! Get down on the ground!" Tony disappeared from the drive-through window, and we heard another scream. And the cops had tased him, and we ran to the front windows and saw Tony writhing on the ground. They took him into custody, and a bunch of officers came out to the front vestibule, and we let them in. And there were a lot of questions for us, and people were trying to get in and go through the drive-through. And the police were awesome and told people that things were shut down for a little bit, and that they were sorry, but they couldn't get their breakfast. Some people were dickheads about it, but fuck them. They didn't know what was going on. Our manager showed up and was pissed we weren't open at first, until the police told her that the safety of her employees was more important than some coffee and breakfast sandwiches. One officer, who I ended up living very close to later on, told her if she wasn't interested in leading people properly, she should get in another line of work. That was pretty awesome. So what happened was, Tony pried the dumpster enclosure doors open enough to get out, and stepped into the grease trap container I had left there. Slipped and fell onto his own knife, and then came at us through the drive-thru. Turns out he was a schizophrenic and was off and on with his meds. He had attacked his mother and did some serious damage to her as he stabbed her a bunch of times. After he did that, he ran from the house and spent the rest of the night in our dumpster area. Somehow, I don't know how, but his mother got to a hospital and was okay, and he eventually got the help he needed. But, man, that was a fucked up time at that burger joint. My first job, submitted by Dakota. My first job was in a pizzeria in my town. I was 15, and my older brother got me in as he worked there for a couple of years and was still a delivery driver. We had a lot of pizza joints in my town out in the suburbs, and all of them were always busy. I worked in the kitchen, slinging dough and making subs and wings and spaghetti. The restaurant had a big dining room, and the takeout and delivery side of things was huge on the weekends. So, I'd be there until like 8 or 9 at night, and I think that's the latest I could actually work at that time. And this was in the 80s. One Friday night, my brother was off and the other delivery guy, Brian, was working. He was in and out all night long, and we were busy as ever. I'd been on a few runs with my brother, and back then you would take a bunch of deliveries out at the same time and try to plan things out so you were in the same neighborhood so as to maximize your time. My manager told me to punch out, and I ordered a pizza to take home and then played the Spy Hunter video game that was in the front lobby while I waited. A few minutes later, Brian heads out to kind of a crappy neighborhood to start his run and make his way back to the shop. I'm playing and playing even after my pizza was ready and sitting in a box on top of an oven. My manager came over and asked if I'd seen Brian, and I told him something like a half hour ago. He just looked strange and walked away, looking at the list of deliveries. I guess they weren't really that far away. Another 10 minutes go by, and I'm going to walk home. My manager says he'll give me a ride if I want. I said sure, and we got out to his car. At the intersection we were situated on, he made a left turn instead of a right, and I told him, "Ron, you know I live the other way." "I know," he said back, "but I just thought of something. I'll only be a minute or two." I shrugged. It was Friday night, my girlfriend was at her mom's house out of town, so I didn't really care. After a few minutes of driving, I start to see where he's heading and ask him what's up. 2 people on that 4 delivery run called saying they didn't get their food. "Why would Brian steal food?" I asked. "I mean, you let us get it for free." I asked like the dumb 15-year-old that I was. "I don't think he stole anything," Ron said. "Maybe he broke down or something, and that's what I'm checking on." This was the 80s, and the only cell phone I had ever seen back then was in the movies, and they were those big bag phones, if anyone else remembers them. We still used pay phones, and hey, they were only a dime. So Ron's looking at his list and goes to a delivery spot, jumps out of the car and runs up to the door and talks to a guy who answers it for a minute. He gets back to his car and I asked if they got their food and he nodded. We drove to the next place and it's in the shittier part I mentioned. Half the streetlights are out, lots of old businesses are boarded up, and in between them are run-down houses. Now, look, I'm not saying the people who lived there were bad or anything, but it was just a rougher place than anywhere else in my town. Ron looked ahead and said, "Oh, shit." It was Brian's car, still running, but he wasn't in it. Ron parked and said to stay in the car and got out to see where Brian was. He looked in the car and then looked up at the house and went over to knock on the door. No one answered, and he cupped his hands around his eyes trying to see in, and he looked startled. I could tell even though I was a little ways away. Ron yanked the screen door open and pushed the other one in and disappeared into the house. He was back in a second, running towards me, and I rolled down the window. "All right, get to someone's house now. Get to someone's house right now and call the cops. Now! Go! Now!" Again, 15-year-old me says, "Why? What's going on?" "Just fucking do it!" he yelled, and ran back to the house and went inside. I jumped out and ran to the nearest house that had lights on, which was just up the ways. I banged on the door, and I'll never forget a woman answered, and I told her to call the police because there was something wrong with the pizza delivery. Yeah, I still haven't lived that one-liner down. I was such an idiot. I finally got it out that our delivery guy was in trouble, and she called the cops for me. They showed up in less than 5 minutes and wanted to know what was going on. I told them that my manager was inside a house, and I pointed to it and said that something was wrong with our driver. They went in, and I was standing on the stoop trying to see in, but I couldn't. One of the cops came out and asked me my name, where I lived, were my parents home, what was I doing here, that kind of thing. I told him everything I could, and he got back in his car and got on his radio, and then got out and told me to have a seat in the back of his car. I did, and he said everything was okay, my parents would be there in a minute. Then an ambulance pulled up, and another cop car, and then another cop car. Ron came back out and stood by the car I was in, and I asked him what was going on through the half-rolled-down window. "Brian's hurt pretty bad," was all Ron said. Again, I couldn't see well, but they rolled Brian out on a stretcher and into the ambulance. My dad came up in his car and talked to the cop who talked to me, and he told me to get into our car and that we were going home. He then said something to Ron and pointed his finger at him, and he didn't look happy at all. He got back in our car, yelled at me for not going straight home after my shift, and when we got home, he told me to go straight to my room. I remember asking if I could take a shower, and he said he didn't give a shit as long as I was out of his sight. I did, and then went to my room feeling bad and scared, and not knowing what I had done wrong. I hated when my dad was mad at me. Anyway, he came up to my room later and poked his head in the door, and he saw I was awake, so he sat down on my bed and said he wasn't mad at me, he was mad at Ron, but I shouldn't have gone out looking for Brian with him at that time of night. He gave me a chuck on the shoulder and told me to hit the sack and we'd talk more in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and my brother came home around 1:30 and came in and asked if I was awake. I said yeah, and asked if he knew what had happened and that I was super confused. He said yes, he had been at the shop that night and had talked to Ron. He produced 2 beers and cracked one and handed it to me and opened his. And this had never happened before. My mom would have been pissed, but their bedroom was downstairs, so they never found out. He was just trying to calm me down. So the story was, Brian had gone on his delivery, and when he got to that house, no one answered the front door. So he went to the side door, and that's when he got jumped by someone or some people. The cops think there was more than 2 or 3 people involved. They dragged him inside, stabbed him twice in the side, and then beat the tar out of him. Whoever it was then tied him to a chair, put tape over his mouth, and took his roll for the pizzeria and his wallet. Then they rigged up a rope around his neck to an overhead light in the room. They had beaten him so bad that he could barely keep his head up, and he was basically choking himself to death when Ron found him. "Is he going to be okay?" I asked. "I think so," said my brother. "He's in the hospital, but from what Ron told me, he's going to be all right." I sipped my beer, and then the tears came out. It then dawned on me why my dad was so pissed. What if those people were still around while I was out there running around? What if they got Ron and then I went in that house too? What if Brian wasn't on that night? What if it was my brother that was driving? My brother hung out with me for a while and told me that it wasn't my fault and said, "You know how Dad gets." The next morning, my dad took me to get haircuts, and we went to a diner for breakfast. He told me he was proud that I had helped the police last night, but that I wasn't going to work at that pizzeria anymore. He'd help me get a job someplace else, and he did. The next week, I started at a greenhouse in town. Ron came over later that day, and my dad and I were in the front yard of our house doing yard work. He apologized to my dad and to me for not thinking things through, and he was just worried about Brian. My dad shook his hand, told him it was okay, and then told him that I wasn't going to be working there anymore, and Ron said that he understood that. Brian was okay after a few weeks in the hospital. He never got a good look at the people who did what they did, but was pretty sure there were 4 of them. The creepier thing is that house was vacant, and the police found a refrigerator that had a bunch of bloody knives and hammers and stuff inside, and that there were blood stains all over the basement floor and some furniture that was down there. The other question was, why didn't they take Brian's car? They never caught the people, by the way. So, that's my story. Well, I guess it's more of Brian's story, but that was one crazy night. I haven't seen Brian in at least 30 years, and wherever he is, I hope he's doing well, but I can understand if he's not. Fast Food Nightmare, submitted by Ellsworth16. This happened to me when I was a senior in high school working at a McDonald's. It was about as glamorous a job as anyone would think, and if you've worked at a place like this, you've lived it. I usually worked middays on the weekends and a couple of early evening shifts during the week. I started in back but was moved to the drive-thru or as an expediter and cashier. For whatever reason, most of the girls who worked there didn't work in the kitchen. Back then, we closed at 11. It wasn't a 24-hour place like a lot of them are now. This story is about one of the scariest nights of my life there. It was a Friday night, and my manager asked me to change my shift from Saturday midday to Friday close. I still got my 7 hours, but someone called off and I was asked to step up. I wasn't thrilled. I had to call off a date with my boyfriend, but he was going to pick me up at the end of the night and go get something to eat someplace else. I rarely ate McDonald's food other than the fries. It was around 10:30 and pretty slow, so everyone was pitching in to clean, so some of us could leave right at 11. My friend, I'll call him Jason, was going to take the garbage out, which was usually a no-no at night. But the area in the back it was always left in for the morning crew was overflowing, and he figured he'd give the guys a break. Big mistake. Jason took a few bags out the back door and threw them in the dumpster, and on his way back, banged on the door for someone to open it. Another guy worked with Ray did, but before the door could close, 3 guys with pantyhose over their heads came bursting in, and one had a gun. I'm not sure if it was real, but it was real enough to scare us at that point. So, at this time of the night, there was only Jason, Ray, me, and my coworker Jen in the store, and Jen was actually in the dining room wiping down tables and had no idea what was going on. The guys were yelling at us, telling us to get down on the floor, and one looked at me and said, "Bitch, get back here now!" I thought about making a run for it, but the guy with the gun was pointing it at me and walking quickly towards me. To be truthful, I was frozen with fright. "Bitch, is there anyone else here?" he yelled in my face, and I didn't say anything at first, and then I shook my head. "Well, get back there with them!" And he pushed me, and I almost fell on my face and stumbled to where the other 2 guys were holding Jason and Ray. The gunman popped one register, and that was empty, and he yelled out, "Shit!" He did the same with another, and then the drive-thru register. There was a little money in each, but he came running back and asked who the manager was. Ray told him he was a production lead, which back then was kind of like a supervisor, but not really a manager. He could open and close the store, but he couldn't access the safe or anything. The gunman told him to open the safe in the front, but Ray said he couldn't, and one of the other guys slammed him into a cooler door, telling him he'd better. The other guy opened the walk-in cooler and told me and Jason to get inside, while the other 2 half-dragged Ray to the safe. They slammed the cooler door shut, but they didn't know it didn't lock, so we thought about trying to get away. Jason said he thought we should ride it out, no one needed to get hurt. We heard faint yelling and then steps scrambling back towards us, and the door opened. The gunman was pointing the gun at Josh now and says, "Don't you leave this fucking room for 10 minutes or I'll be back." He slammed the door again, and we just stood there, shivering from the cool and also the terror. A few minutes went by, and Jason said he was going out to see where Ray was. I stayed in the cooler, and Jason left for a minute and then came back saying that he was going to call the police. The guys had beat Ray up pretty good, and I remember he was bleeding from his mouth and nose. He told us they had snapped when he couldn't open the safe. Jason was on the phone at the front of the restaurant and called the police, but 2 cars came flying into the parking lot at the same time with their lights and sirens going, filling everything with that strobe light effect. The front doors were still unlocked, and 4 cops ran into the store, saw us and asked if we were okay and if the guys were still in the restaurant. Jason and I said no, but our friend was badly hurt. An ambulance was called and more police showed up. I asked if I could call the store manager, and 1 cop said it was a good idea. Terry was a good guy and rushed out to make sure that we were all okay and was in shock almost as much as we were. He was in his late 40s and had worked in McDonald's stores for a long time and had never had anything like this happen before. A few minutes later, my boyfriend showed up, and the police told him to leave, and I barely had enough time to yell to him that I was okay and would call him. And that's when Jen came up to the front, and the police also told her that she couldn't go inside just yet. Jen had heard what was going on when the guys came in, and she ran out a back side door and across the street to a gas station a couple of blocks up and called the police from there. So after all was said and done, Ray was okay but had a smashed up lip, lost a tooth from being pistol whipped, and the rest of us were just scared. The robbers got away with around $80. What a waste of time. After all of this, I was planning on quitting but wanted to save a little more money before going someplace else. Ray had quit by that time, and Jason was going to do the same. But the scariest part was about 2 weeks later. I was working the drive-thru on a midday shift and took an order. When the car pulled up to the window, I reminded the guy about what he owed, and he said, "Here you go," handing me the money. The voice seemed familiar somehow, and when I got him his food and gave it to him, he said, "I told you I'd be back." He had a gun on the front seat. It was the guy who robbed us. I backed away from the window, screaming. He took off, and Terry ran to me, asking what happened. I just remember saying over and over, "That was him, that was him, that was the guy, that was the guy." Terry called the police, and they questioned me, and I gave them the best description of him in the car that I could. Then I quit on the spot. I called my dad, he drove out, and that was the last time I ever went into that place. I even got my last paycheck handed to me through the drive-thru window by Terry. Terry and I did talk one more time when we saw each other at the movies a month or so later. He let me know the guy eventually was caught and was charged with robbing a few other places around our hometown. I hope that asshole got a lot of jail time for beating up Ray and robbing us. Those 2 events scared the living shit out of me, and even though I only saw it for a brief moment in the drive-thru, I'll never forget that guy's face as long as I live. A Restaurant Stalker, submitted by Meganomics. My name is Julie, and this story took place a few years ago in 2013. I was working at a restaurant in my town in Oklahoma. It was a Hooters, and I got an unwanted stalker just by doing my job. If you don't know, Hooters is a place that the staff is mostly females who wear specific outfits that are all the same. I guess that it's not really a fast food place, but I'm sending this to you anyway, Uncle Josh. So, our outfits are really short shorts at the time. Low-cut tops and shiny pantyhose. I haven't worked there in a couple of years, but I guess they have a different uniform now. Anyway, I was in college and worked there because the tips were usually good, and most of the people who came in to eat and drink were really cool. One night, a group of guys came in and got one of my tables. They were all there for some fantasy football thing, and at first were more into their event and just gave me orders for what they wanted as far as food and beers. As the night went on, one guy started acting a little odd. I could see he was checking me out, and that was okay. I mean, honestly, my clothing begged you to look at me. His name was Barry, and he was a little older than me and was in law school at the same place I was going to school. I checked on the table to see if they needed anything, took another round of drinks, and then I felt Barry's hand brush against the back of my leg, right at the curve of my butt. I brushed it off as him just raising his hand at the table, and I went to get their drinks. I figured maybe I was too close to him, leaning over to get the drink orders. As the night wore on, I could feel him looking at me wherever I went, and it was getting creepy. When I went back to the table, I heard his friend saying, do it, just ask her, man." But it wasn't until the end of the night when they were leaving that he did ask me out. I told him I was flattered, but I had a boyfriend and was quote-unquote not on the market. He said that was a shame, and I said, "No, not really," and his friends all laughed. I lied. I had recently broken up with my boyfriend, but it was easier to say that I had one than to tell someone I wasn't interested in them. Maybe not the best way to do things, but oh well. The point isn't whether or not I was attached, but what happened after was crazy. They finished their football party, and I grabbed the money that they had left on the table, and as I counted it and checked the tab, they left me a decent tip. Then I saw a bill poking out of a folded piece of paper. It was a $100 bill with a note that said, "I think you should reconsider." There was a phone number on the note and the name Barry. I showed it to my coworker Fran. She said I was just a lucky bitch, and I wondered if I should keep it. I did keep it, but I later wish I hadn't. The next night I worked was 2 days later, and my friend Fran said the guy named Barry had been in the night before asking for me. I shrugged and didn't think much about it, but that night he came back in and took a seat at the bar. I had to walk past him a few times, and the third time he touched my arm and asked what I thought of his note. I simply said it was nice and thank you, but I'm just not interested. I should say at this point that Barry was not a textbook creeper. He was actually pretty good looking and in good shape, but there was just something off about him. He started to say something else, but I told him I had another table to get to and to have a good night. Things got busy and I didn't pay attention or notice him anymore, and he wasn't there at the end of the shift. Mike, my manager, walked me out to my car. He was a great guy and walked all of the girls to their cars, even if we were in a group, and he pointed to something on the windshield of my Eclipse. It was an unsigned note that said, "You'll be wrapping those legs around my head before you know it." It had to be Barry, and then I told Mike about him. He said he'd stay on it, and if Barry came back, he would let him know to lay off. I didn't see Barry the next few nights I was at work, but I started to get texts from an unknown number saying really sexual stuff about my body and what the person wanted to do to me. Some of it was in-depth, saying things like, "I want to tie you down and make your pussy foam," or "My cock wants to tickle your tonsils." I remember those distinctly. I never saved those texts early, but man, I never will forget those. Barry did come in with his friends again. I told Mike, and he made sure to give the table to another girl so I didn't have to deal with him. Barry went to the bathroom after a time, and Mike stopped him and was polite and told him he was welcome at the restaurant, but told him he needed to stay away from me. I guess Barry said no problem, and that was that. About a week later, I got back to my house that I shared with 3 other girls, and my roommate Leslie said there was something for me. It was one of those edible arrangements with chocolate-covered strawberries. There wasn't a card, and I thought maybe it was my ex-boyfriend. I was on good terms with him and texted him, and he said no, it wasn't from him. Again, the only thing I could think of was this guy named Barry. That night was the beginning of the insanity. I certainly wasn't going to eat any of the fruit and didn't want any of the girls I lived with to eat it either, so I threw it in our kitchen garbage can. The next morning, I woke up and screamed. The basket was on my desk, and some of the strawberries had condoms on them, and a typed note that read, "Don't you like fucking strawberries? Ha ha ha." My roommate Crystal was the only other person home, and she came running to my room and asked what was wrong. I pointed to the basket, and her eyes got huge. "What the fuck?" she asked. I got up and threw it into the garbage and posted to our house Facebook page that whoever did that wasn't funny, but everyone said they didn't do it. I immediately again thought of Barry, but how the hell could he have gotten into the house? I asked everyone if they had locked the doors, and Crystal said that she was the last one up, but she couldn't be sure that she did lock the door. Later that morning, I got a text from the unknown number that read, "I'm going to show you that pain can be pleasure." This was the first one that I screen capped because it actually frightened me. I went to work that night and showed it to Mike. He said I should call the cops, and I did, with nothing other than the text and the basket, but it had been handled by me and most of my roommates, so there wasn't much they could do. I tried blocking the unknown number, but I have no idea if that really did anything. I didn't see Barry at all, and got no more messages on my phone or any other weird shit happening at my place. I was going home for Thanksgiving, so I was glad to get away for a little bit and just be with my family. My parents lived about 2 hours away, and I was going right after work that night. I had packed all my stuff earlier and had it in my car ready to go. I didn't want to waste any time going back to my house for it. Work was uneventful and kind of quiet, as most people were at other bars or probably doing what I was doing, getting ready to go home. I was gearing up for my dad. He didn't like that I worked at Hooters. Daddy's little girl stuff, I guess. Mike told me I could leave, and he walked me to my car and said Happy Thanksgiving, and I got on the road and turned up some music. All was well for the first hour, and there weren't a lot of cars out once I got off the highway. My parents lived out in the country, so it was just dark back roads with no streetlights until I drove through little villages on the way. I stopped at a gas station to get something to drink in one little town and to use the bathroom. I was in there for maybe 5 minutes, but when I got back to my car, there was a rose that had been painted black, and it was under my windshield wiper with another typed note that said, "Driving alone is dangerous for little girls. I am watching you." If I hadn't just gone to the bathroom, I might have peed myself right there. I jumped in my car, hit the wipers to get the stuff off, and flew out of the parking lot. I sped all the way to my parents' house, pulled in the driveway, and then ran into the house. I was nearing tears, and even though I was still wearing my Hooters outfit, my dad didn't say anything about it and asked what was wrong. After I told my parents a brief version of what had been going on, he went outside to get my things out of my car and looked up and down the road for some reason, and then came back inside. I showered and changed and sat with my parents in the living room, and that's when my dad started in on the "this is only happening because of that place you work" shit. And then my phone pinged. "Does Daddy have daughter issues? What will he say when my dick is in your ass?" read the text. My face went white and I showed my mom. She said she was calling the police and did. But the text didn't stop. "I have a gun and you'll be doing whatever I tell you to do soon." 5 minutes later, "I've made a special cage just for you. You'll be seeing it soon." This was a small town, and an officer came over and I showed him my phone. But again, just like before, there wasn't a lot he could do. He told me to keep saving the messages going forward and try to lay low. A lot of help he was, but I know it wasn't his fault. I went to my old room and called my friend Amy and just cried and cried, telling her I was so scared. My dad was really mad and went around checking the windows and doors. I finally started to settle down and fell asleep after turning my phone off. The next day I got up and was going to help my mom with the Thanksgiving Day food and wanted to also go for a run, but my dad said I should stay inside and just take it easy. I did need the charger for my phone and I had left it in my car, so I went out to get it. Under the windshield was another note. This one was handwritten and it said, "Don't you turn your fucking phone off on me again." I yelled for my dad and he came out running and saw it. He called the cops this time, and another guy came out and took the note. I was scared, but I was also angry. My older brothers came home for the day and heard about what was happening, and they went into beast mode. They wanted to protect their little sister. I charged my phone, and about an hour later it rang. My dad said not to pick it up, and it went to voicemail, but whoever called didn't leave a message. Everything was quiet after that, and I tried to enjoy my long weekend as best I could. And I actually did relax enough to have a good time, but I got nervous when I knew I had to go home. My one brother had to drive the same way I did, so he tailed me to my house that Saturday afternoon and got me inside safely. My roommates weren't supposed to be back till later that night, and some of them were actually coming on Sunday, so I was going to be alone for a little bit, and I was trying not to freak out. I decided to watch a DVD and got engrossed in the Hunger Games, and for a while forgot that I was scared. Then I heard glass breaking in the kitchen. I jumped up and looked around the corner into the kitchen and saw a hand coming through the door window, opening the locks. I screamed and ran upstairs to my room and slammed the door shut and tried to push my desk against it. And then I hid in my closet, and that's when I could hear someone walking around downstairs. I was going to call the cops, but then realized I had left my phone downstairs in the living room. I was shaking and almost crying when I heard the footsteps come up the hallway and go into my roommate's room. My room was the next one down the hall. The intruder fumbled with the knob and pushed the door open, but the desk did stop it from opening. I was looking out a crack in the closet door, but couldn't see anything, and then I heard a voice say, "You could have made this easier." Then I heard loud thumping, and another voice say, "Get the fuck on the floor, motherfucker!" And a scuffling, and lots of grunts and stuff, and then a loud thud. Then another voice cried out, "You're not going anywhere, asshole!" There was a knock at my door. "Are you in there? Are you okay?" I opened the door and saw the face of a guy who lived next door. I got up and went over to him, crying my eyes out, and I was hysterical. He and his roommate had seen Barry breaking into the back door and came running from their house. My saviors had knocked Barry to the floor, and one guy was basically sitting on him, keeping him down. I didn't know these guys that well, but I do know that they played rugby. I mean, they were big guys. "Call the police," said one guy. His name was Jeff, and turns out he's now my boyfriend. I did, and they came out. Barry was screaming, "Let me go!" but they kept him at bay. He was wearing all black and had a ski mask on his head and face. I knew it was him when the police came and they took it off and handcuffed him. In the hallway was a gym bag with duct tape, a bottle of some kind of pills, and 2 sets of handcuffs. There was also a knife on the floor the guys had kicked away from him. This sicko had followed me to my family's house and tailed me home, and he knew I was by myself. He was going to kidnap me, and what's even sicker, when the police investigated it deeper, at his place there was a dog cage in the basement with other restraints in it. That message he sent was totally true. Barry had all these bondage porno mags and DVDs all over his house, and I shudder to think what he had planned for me. He was arrested, of course, and charged with a lot of things that will keep him in jail for quite a while. As far as I know, he's still working on his 18-year sentence. Like I said, I started dating Jeff and stopped working at Hooters, and I got a job as a secretary in a law office. I think it's funny that Barry was a law school student, and I'm the one who ended up working in a law office. That was a really scary ordeal for me. I know it's not about fast food like I said at the beginning, but it did start with food. The creepiest thing that I still can't get out of my head was Barry saying, "You could have made this easier." Thanks for listening, gang. I appreciate everyone who keeps sending stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. And if you haven't, but want to hear your story here on this channel, email away. I never turn down a submission, no matter how long or short. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't. Throw me a bone on my Patreon page if you care to. And be sure to check out my live paranormal radio show every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, theedgeoftheunknown.com. Everybody take care, and I'll see you shortly with another volume of the scariest true stories you'll hear anywhere. Until then, Be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.